Many people learn very early that holding yourself together is a virtue. You show up on time. You stay calm. You do what is expected of you. Even when something inside feels strained, you keep it contained. Over years, this posture can stop feeling like a strategy and start feeling like identity. In modern culture, this quality is often rewarded, especially in leadership. Leaders are expected to be composed, decisive, reliable, not reactive, not overwhelmed, not visibly uncertain. But there is a quiet question underneath this ideal. At what point does discipline stop supporting leadership and start narrowing the person who leads? Welcome to Mini Mind Hack. Today, we'll look at the Japanese concept known as Bushido, not as a romantic code of honor, and not as something to imitate, but as a historically grounded system of discipline and identity. We'll trace where it emerged and why it made sense in its original environment. We'll look at the kind of self it was designed to produce, and then we'll explore why similar patterns still shape modern leadership cultures, and where their hidden costs begin to appear. Bushido is commonly translated as the way of the warrior. But it did not begin as a single written code, and it was never applied uniformly across all of Japan. It emerged gradually between roughly the 12th and 17th centuries, during a long period of military rule, political instability, and strict social hierarchy. From the late 12th century onward, political power in Japan shifted away from the imperial court and toward warrior governments. The first of these was centered in Kamakura. Later, power consolidated under successive shogunates, most notably the Tokugawa regime, which ruled from the early 17th century until the mid-19th. Japan at this time was not a centralized nation-state in the modern sense. It was a network of domains ruled by regional lords, known as daimyo. Each domain was supported by a household of samurai who served as soldiers, administrators, and local authorities. Social life was sharply hierarchical. Peasants produced agricultural surplus under heavy obligations. Artisans manufactured goods in towns. Merchants handled trade and finance, often accumulating wealth but holding low social status. Samurai occupied a privileged position not because they produced goods, but because they were entrusted with order. Their role was to manage violence, administer justice, and maintain stability. Importantly, life for samurai was not constant warfare. Especially during the long peace of the Tokugawa period, many samurai functioned as bureaucrats. They collected taxes, they resolved disputes, they kept records. Their income often came from stipends rather than land. Their status depended less on battlefield success and more on visible conduct. In this context, how you carried yourself mattered. Composure was not just personal style, it was a social signal. Loyalty, restraint, predictability. These traits made a ruling military class legible to those beneath them, and to each other. Japan's relationship with the outside world also shaped this system. Earlier centuries involved active cultural exchange with China and Korea. The 16th century brought European traders and firearms, but in the 17th century, the Tokugawa regime sharply restricted foreign contact through policies often described as sakoku, or closed country. Foreign influence was limited, movement was controlled. In an environment where external options narrowed and internal order became paramount, moral systems that disciplined behavior were not abstract ideals. They were practical tools for survival. Bushido emerged at the intersection of these conditions. It drew from Confucian ethics, which emphasized hierarchy, duty, and loyalty. Zen Buddhism contributed methods for regulating attention, accepting impermanence, and meeting fear without collapse. Courtly and indigenous traditions added ritual, propriety, and concern for honor. Together, these influences formed a way of organizing the self. At its core, Bushido emphasized loyalty to one's lord, disciplined self-restraint, simplicity in personal life, and readiness to sacrifice personal comfort, and sometimes life itself, for obligation. This was not abstract philosophy. It was a behavioral system. It told you what to do with fear, what to do with hesitation, what to do with shame, and what to do with private desire. To understand its psychological function, we need to look at the kind of self it required. A samurai was expected to regulate fear and suppress hesitation, to act according to duty rather than impulse. Emotions were not denied, but they were subordinated. Identity was anchored in role. You knew who you were by knowing what was expected of you. This structure offered clarity. It reduced internal conflict by narrowing the range of acceptable responses. It made behavior predictable in a society where unpredictability could mean violence or loss of trust. But this internal order came with a cost. From a modern psychological perspective, sustained self-control is not neutral. It requires ongoing effort and attention. It reduces flexibility over time. When control becomes constant, people often experience fatigue, irritability, and emotional narrowing, not because they are weak, but because the system demands too much regulation. Carl Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist working in the early 20th century, described a related process. When parts of the psyche, fear, dependency, vulnerability, are repeatedly excluded from conscious life, they do not disappear. They move into what Jung called the shadow. There they accumulate pressure, and they tend to return indirectly, as anxiety, rigidity, or sudden breakdown. This helps explain a pattern seen in many high-functioning leaders. From the outside, they appear composed and capable. Internally, experience becomes narrow. Life turns into a sequence of obligations. Responsiveness gives way to endurance. Sociology helps us scale this pattern beyond the individual. Hartmut Rosa, a contemporary German sociologist, studies how modern societies relate to time, speed, and control. He uses the term resonance to describe moments when the world feels responsive, when something answers us and we feel genuinely engaged. Rosa argues that cultures organized around mastery, efficiency, and predictability tend to reduce these moments. Control secures order, but it can also dull responsiveness. This is where Bushido quietly echoes into the present. Many modern leadership cultures operate under an unspoken code. Stay composed, be decisive, do not burden others, push through discomfort. Leaders learn to speak in solutions, not in uncertainty. They learn to treat emotion as noise. They learn that asking for help carries reputational risk. The language is modern. The structure is not. This is not an argument against discipline. Bushido worked because it matched its environment. Clear roles and strong self-regulation are stabilizing under threat and scarcity. The problem arises when a system designed for survival becomes a permanent identity. When endurance replaces responsiveness. When integrity is measured only by how little you bend. Healthy selfhood requires oscillation, periods of control followed by periods of openness, structure followed by adjustment. Without this movement, discipline hardens into rigidity. So how might we read Bushido today? Not as a model to imitate, but as a mirror. It shows what happens when honor and control become central organizing values. It clarifies both the strength of such systems and their limits. A useful question is not, am I disciplined enough? But, what parts of myself are allowed to speak, and which are consistently overruled? Another is, does my leadership style support adaptation, or only endurance? Bushido reminds us that identity is shaped by internalized rules. Those rules once solved real problems. But when conditions change, rules need revision. The question is not whether you can endure. The question is whether you can still respond. Thank you for staying with me. If you'd like more essays that connect lived experience with research and culture, consider subscribing or leaving a comment. Take care, and I'll see you next time.